Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, is this the best stretch of Rudy Gobert's career in a Timberwolves uniform? We'll compare. We'll also look at the Western Conference tiebreakers with just 4 games to play. Where might the Wolves end up in the West? And who do they have to leap over in order to get out of the play-in, to stay out of the play-in, and maybe get home court advantage in the first round? It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I am the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Happy game day. The Wolves are in Milwaukee as this road trip rolls on to take on the Bucks tonight. We'll talk about that matchup toward the end of the show. A lot to get to first, though. We got to talk about Rudy Gobert, the stretch he's been on over the last 7 or so games for Minnesota. We'll compare that to the first 2 seasons with the Wolves that Rudy has had. And is it the best stretch of his career? Is this recency bias? I'll give you kind of arguments for both sides, and then we'll come to a conclusion here today on that. We'll also talk about some of the crazy tiebreak scenarios in the Western Conference coming into play on Monday and actually on Tuesday, too. There weren't very many games Monday night. The Wolves are in a weird 4-way tie currently in the Western Conference. They could be 5th. They could be 8th. What does the tiebreaker scenario say? We'll break it all down before we get to Wolves Bucks preview toward the end of the show. A big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And I want to remind you about the newsletter that we send out Monday through Friday. It is like basically what the newsletter is. It comes to your email inbox every day, Monday through Friday, and you'll get kind of the key topic and some other takeaways from the show. So it'll give you a sense for what's on the show that day, build out some additional things, some stats a bit more, depending on the newsletter. So be sure to go check that out. It's definitely worth your while to subscribe at LockedOnDaily.com. You'll get it to your inbox every day. There's also some great NBA content. We've got some national writers that drop in a couple of times a week. So it's definitely worth the subscribe. Again, LockedOnDaily.com. All right. Let's go ahead and get into this, the Rudy Gobert conversation. And we talked a bit about Rudy, actually each of the last couple of post-game pods, following the Wolves win, the Nuggets when he was good, the Nets when he was great. And then in the most recent win over the Sixers, if it wasn't for Rudy and then some of Ant's heroics late, that could have been dicey. Rudy Gobert was fantastic. And I think the context for this is important. Rudy Gobert has just had a little bit of a downturn in a lot of areas this year. And I was relatively, say, hard on Rudy, but I feel like I call it like I see it. And early in the season, I didn't think he was doing enough on the glass. At the All-Star break, it was one of my big surprises of the year so far was just how big of a hit Rudy had taken on the glass, especially early in the season. It seemed like he wanted the ball more often than he should be getting it offensively. And I just didn't think he was completely locked in the way he needed to be. And then as the years worn on, he's gotten better and better. And I don't know if it's partly playing into shape. Maybe it's a sense of urgency for this team, given, floundering plus or minus, a couple games around the 500 mark for much of the season. He, of course, had the injury around the All-Star break and missed, 3 weeks or so. So, I don't know what it was exactly, but Rudy's kicked it into gear. Now, he's still pretty much, I don't think there's any doubt, he's going to have the worst rebound rate of his entire career this year. Not rebounds per game, rebound rate. So what percentage of available rebounds when he's on the floor does he grab? His career mark is 21.3%. He's only had one season below 20% in his entire career, and that was back in 2017-18. And that was 18.8%. This year, he's at 18.2%, and that has really jumped over the last few weeks, and we'll dig into that a bit more. So it's still going to be the lowest rebound rate of his career. It's going to be the lowest usage rate of his career, even going all the way back to when he was, a relatively unknown, played in half the games off the bench his first season and a half or so in the league. And still the usage rate was higher. The usage rate is a career low, which actually surprises me a little bit, given how involved he's been recently offensively. The block rate, it's higher than it was his first year in Minnesota, but it's on track to be the second lowest of his career. And it will be the second lowest of his career. So there's a lot of numbers that suggest it hasn't been as good of a season for Rudy Gobert. However, over the last 7 games, Rudy Gobert has been phenomenal. And the Timberwolves broadcast, Jim Peterson, I think a couple of times, I think in each of the Nets and Sixers game, has mentioned, hey, is this the best stretch of Rudy Gobert's career in Minnesota? I just kind of like thrown that out there. So I thought, let's dig into this, at least statistically. And I'm not going to remember all the nuances of the last two seasons. And like right now, I could tell you, in addition to the numbers, Rudy's doing some other stuff very well. And I talked about it a little bit on the postgame pod on Monday, following the win over the weekend against the Sixers, Saturday's win. So I'll talk about that in a second. But speaking strictly statistically, over the last 7 games, the Wolves have gone 6-1. The only loss being that 16-point loss at Indiana about a week and a half ago. Over the last 7, Rudy Gobert is averaging 18.6 points and 16.3 rebounds per game. He's averaging only 1 block, but 1.4 steals per game. So together, that's 2.4 stocks. So does he have any stretches, plus or minus 7 games, as few as 5 or 6, maybe up to 10, whatever we got to do to kind of get in that same neighborhood of games to make the numbers look similar? Basically 19 and 16 is what we're looking at. 19 and 16 and 2.5 stocks. The short answer is no. But I did think this was interesting. Going back through his game logs the last couple of years, the recency bias is very much a thing. We forget just how good he was the defensive player of the year, pretty hands down. I know a lot of people voted for Wemby, but it wasn't that close of a vote. Rudy Gobert won defensive player of the year last year for the 4th time in his career. Like, the dude was really, really good, and he's been really good this year. But like last season was a phenomenal season for an age 31, center season. He was fantastic. He did have a 5-game stretch in which the Wolves went 5-0, late November, early December last year. It was like right around Thanksgiving through the first week of December last season, the 23-24 season. Rudy averaged 17 and 14 with 3.3 blocks per game. Throw in the steals, and he averaged nearly 4 stocks per game over that stretch of 5 games. So the points and rebounds are slightly, what did I say? 19 and 16. This was a 17 and 14, but almost 4 stocks instead of 2.5 stocks. That's a pretty strong stretch. And mixed in there, he had a 26 and 12 against a bad Hornets team. He had a 16 and 20 against a bad Spurs team. And then he had a 16, 20, and 6 blocks against a banged up and poor Memphis team during that stretch. And at the time, of course, the Wolves were just completely and utterly dominant as a team, got off to an awesome start that year. Going back 2 seasons to his first year in Minnesota, there was really nothing similar. The closest was a stretch where he averaged 17 and 12.5 points in mid-February to about the first week in March. It was an 8-game stretch, 17 and 12.5 and 2.8 stocks over that stretch. And the Wolves were just 4-4. They had an overtime loss to Brooklyn, a loss to Philadelphia. He missed a game mixed in there against Golden State, and some other bad losses, Washington and Charlotte, actually, during that stretch. This was 2 years ago when the Wolves, of course, as a team, were not as good overall and ended up being the 8th seed in the Western Conference. A bit of a rough stretch there for Rudy, a bit of a rough stretch for Minnesota, and not as dominant of a stretch for Rudy Gobert. So, statistically speaking, this is probably about the best 7-game stretch that at least I could find in Rudy Gobert's nearly 3 years in Minnesota. Plus, but I want to underscore again, if you go back and look at last year's game log, he had some stretches last season where Rudy Gobert was just really dominant, and it's so easy to forget just how good he was last year. And I know he only averaged 14 and 13 for the season. Well, he's going to average about 12 and 11 this year. So 14 and 13, that is his best year of his 3 in Minnesota. It's not far off pace. It's pretty close to where he was in his second All-Star season with Utah when he also won Defensive Player of the Year. It's just not quite as gaudy as a couple of those 16 and 13 seasons that he put together with, a couple and a half blocks per game as well back in his late 20s. But he was really good last year. In addition to the numbers, what else is he doing really well right now? Well, we talked about this a little bit on yesterday's show, but he's finding soft spots in the defense, making himself available for teammates for dump-off passes in the dunker spot, for lobs. I feel like we've seen more lobs this year than last year. I'd be willing to bet that that's the case, even though the usage rate is down. There's at least been more successful lobs. I think that Julius Randle's finally gotten to a point where he trusts Rudy Gobert. That chemistry isn't quite to where the Karl-Anthony Towns Rudy Gobert chemistry was last year from a high-low passing standpoint. But we're seeing more drop-off passes from driving Randle, driving Anthony Edwards. Conley lobs are still there a little bit. We've seen a little bit of Jaden to Rudy. We've seen some nods to Rudy. I just think he's doing a better job lately of making himself available, finding the soft spots in the defense, and making his teammates, really giving his teammates no option but to trust him by being so open that they've got to. I would also say the offensive rebounding. And I know I talked about the rebound rate overall being down, but here recently, the offensive rebound rate is really, really solid. And it's actually going to be kind of middle of the pack over the course of his career. Not quite to where it was last year. Last year's actually the third best offensive rebound rate of his entire career. So the work on the offensive glass as the Wolves have kind of tweaked their approach when it comes to offensive rebounding. That's been huge for Minnesota. It's been big for their offense going back to about January 1st. Really the start of this calendar year is when the Wolves started to concentrate more as an offense on the offensive glass. Instead of trying to get back in transition, it was more about, hey, let's give ourselves an opportunity against a defense that's an opposing offense that's trying to get back the other way in transition. Let's just see what we could do damage-wise on the offensive glass. And Rudy Gobert has been a huge part of that. So we have to credit him for kind of a refocus midseason. I do think there's something to him coming off the Olympics, like maybe a little bit banged up like he was 2 years ago coming off a Eurobasket. Took him a minute to get his feet under him and to feel healthy. And since he's come back from the in-season injury, he's been really, really good. And specifically over the last 7. And they need him to show up in a big way this week. Milwaukee, Memphis, big games against good teams, and then 2 home games against inferior teams to close out the season. We'll talk about in a minute what that means for Minnesota, where the Wolves could end up, and what those confusing tiebreakers look like in the West. We'll close today's show by talking Wolves Bucks. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Robinhood. With Robinhood Gold, you can now enjoy the VIP treatment, receiving a 3% IRA match on retirement contributions. The privileges of the very privileged are no longer exclusive. With Robinhood Gold, your annual IRA contributions are boosted by 3%. Plus, you also get 4% APY on your cash and non-retirement accounts. That's over 8 times the national savings average. The perks of the high net worth are now available for any net worth. The new gold standard is here with Robinhood Gold. To receive your 3% boost on annual IRA contributions, sign up at Robinhood.com/gold. Investing involves risk, rate subject to change. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold at $5 per month for 1 year from first match. Must keep funds in IRA for 5 years. Go to Robinhood.com/boost. Over 8 times the national average savings account interest rate claim is based on data from the FDIC as of November 18th, 2024. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC. Gold membership is offered by Robinhood Gold, LLC. All right. So the Western Conference. Now, we've talked a lot about where could the Wolves end up? And really, there's a whole world of possibilities as of right now. The Timberwolves are currently coming into play on Tuesday in a 4-way tie in the Western Conference for the 5, 6, 7, 8 seed. Finally, these teams have all played the same number of games as Minnesota. The Clippers, Warriors, Wolves, and Grizzlies are all 46 and 32. And we've talked before, and I should also point out, they're all only a half game out of the 4 spot with Denver and only 2 games out of the 3 spot with the Lakers. So not impossible, although it's unlikely with only 4 to play, that any of these teams could also catch the Lakers for the 3 spot in the Western Conference. And also I should state that there's no possibility of falling below 8. The Kings and Mavs are locked into the 9 and 10 spots. It just matters, we don't know who's going to get which spot. The Kings were so bad for so long here recently, and now all of a sudden it's flipped. The Kings have won 3 in a row. They won again on Monday night, and then the Mavs have lost 2 in a row. So who knows? Doesn't matter. We're talking about 3 through 8 are unsettled in the West. 1 and 2 are locked in, and 9 and 10 are locked in. The biggest battle, 5, 6, 7, 8, Wolves, Clippers, Warriors, and Grizzlies. Head-to-head, if only 2 of these teams are finished with identical records, the Wolves win the head-to-head against the Clippers by virtue of a 3-0 series lead against the Clippers this year, or series win, I should say. The Wolves would lose the matchup against the Warriors because they went 1 and 3 against Golden State. And they would lose the matchup against Memphis. They're 0 and 2 against Memphis, and they play them again later this week. Okay. So head-to-head, if the Wolves and Clippers both say end up 5th and the Warriors and Grizzlies finish behind, the Wolves would get the 5 spot. The Clippers would fall to 6. If the Wolves were to somehow jump up, no, I shouldn't say somehow, they're only half game behind Denver. If the Wolves and Denver were tied with an identical record, the Wolves would also win that tiebreaker by virtue of the season series win. Now, if multiple teams are tied with the same record, so like right now, there's 4 teams that are 46 and 32, the tiebreakers, it's actually not conference record. I incorrectly mentioned that I thought that was a tiebreaker. That is actually the third tiebreaker. Third one is technically divisional record if you're all in the same division, but they're not. So you would skip to the fourth tiebreaker. So we'll start with the third tiebreaker, which is cumulative head-to-head record among the group of teams that are tied. So if the Clippers, Warriors, Wolves, Grizzlies ended up tied, so like where they're sitting right now, what's each of those teams' winning percentages against the group? Well, the Clippers are 6-3 against the Warriors, Wolves, and Grizzlies. They have one remaining game. So they can't, in a scenario where all 4 teams are tied, the Clippers win. So that's why right now, if you pull up the standings, the Clippers are 5th in the Western Conference because they have the best record among those 4 teams against each other. Second is Golden State, who's 6-5. They have one remaining game. They play the Clippers. So the Clippers and Warriors play each other. So they could lose. If the Warriors were to lose, they would be 6-6. The Wolves are 4-5 against this group. They have one remaining game against Memphis. So this sounds good, right? Because if the Warriors lose against the Clippers, the Wolves beat Memphis, then they have the same record. However, then it kicks to the individual tiebreaker, which Golden State would win. So in any sort of groups tiebreaker scenario where the Wolves and Warriors are in it together, the Wolves lose to the Warriors. The Wolves would beat the Clippers head-to-head if the Warriors and Memphis are not involved in the tiebreaker. But in a 3 or 4-way tie, the Wolves would finish third out of those 3 teams. Memphis is only 3-6 against the Clippers, Warriors, and Minnesota. So yes, 2 of their 3 wins against that group came against Minnesota, and 1 to come, but they can't finish better than 4th. So if these 4 teams all somehow finish the year tied, the standings would look exactly how they do if you pull up like ESPN right now. The Wolves would be 7th, Memphis would be 8th. So the Wolves would host the play-in game against Memphis, and the winner would get the 7th seed. The Clippers would be 5, and the Warriors would be 6. Now, if the Nuggets get involved, I didn't do all that math and see how the Nuggets, like, it's pretty unlikely we end up with a 5-team tie, but it's not impossible. It's certainly on the table. And again, if the Wolves have a head-to-head tie against the Clippers or Nuggets, they win that tiebreaker. Head-to-head against the Warriors or Grizzlies, they lose that one. And then otherwise, it's a cumulative win percentage situation. Now, best case scenario, obviously, it depends on your perspective. The Wolves aren't going to be super cutesy about this and like try and, finagle their way into a specific spot. But I mean, like the advantage of the 4 seed would, of course, be having home court. And, that I guess that's the biggest advantage. Obviously, you're out of the play-in. However, you're on the same side of the bracket as OKC. So if you win in the first round against the 5 seed, you then have to play the Thunder in the second round. Whereas if you finish 6th, or I guess 7th in that case, then you're on the opposite side of the bracket. And if you upset the 2 or 3 seed, currently the Rockets or Lakers, then you wouldn't have to play OKC until the Western Conference Finals. Now, the worst spot, if you want to avoid OKC, would obviously be 5th, because then you don't get home court. And if you win, you have to play OKC in the second round. I don't care that much. I mean, it'd be great to avoid OKC. Maybe someone else knocks them out. But I actually think the Wolves might be the hardest matchup for the Thunder in the Western Conference. You could argue maybe Houston, because they play a similar kind of frenetic athletic style. But I think Minnesota's ability to, they've shown this against OKC, in a game and a quarter, I guess, because they were brutal in the second game that they won until the fourth quarter, that they have the ability to kind of combat, their size can wear down OKC. They can score it a few different ways, which if the Wolves, I understand the Thunder's strength of turning teams over, and the Wolves' one of their biggest weaknesses is turning the ball over themselves. That's really the only thing about the matchup that petrifies me other than SGA. But like we're talking about the playoffs, you're going to face SGA, or you're going to face Jokic, you're going to face LeBron and Luka, or you're going to face, Kawhi or Steph. Like, you're going to face somebody, right? So all that to say, the biggest thing for me is avoiding the play-in. If they finish 6th and they have to play the Lakers or Nuggets or somebody, fine. You're also still then at that point, you're avoiding the play-in, but you're also on the opposite side of the bracket as OKC. If you finish 5th, you're avoiding the play-in, you don't get home court, and you're on the same side of the bracket as OKC. And if you finish 4th, you at least have the home court thing. And I know the Wolves haven't been as good at home this year. They actually have identical home and road records with 2 to play in each place. I don't care. You still want to have home court. I mean, you still have to assume that that's something you would want to have. So we're scoreboard watching here the rest of this week. And remaining schedules, we know the Wolves have the easiest. Like if we just look at Tuesday, of course, the Wolves are at Milwaukee. Memphis is at Charlotte, so a very, very winnable game for Memphis. And then you go on down the line, and the Lakers are at OKC. Golden State is at Phoenix. Phoenix is about to be eliminated. They're not mathematically eliminated, but it is close. I think if they lose, they'll maybe be a half game away from being eliminated mathematically. And then the Clippers are at home for San Antonio. So all of the teams that the Wolves are, the Lakers are not going to be favored at OKC, although they did just win at OKC on Sunday. But Golden State's very likely to win at Phoenix. The Clippers are likely to win at home against San Antonio. The Wolves at Milwaukee is the toughest one on the schedule. Memphis is likely to win at Charlotte. So we'll be scoreboard watching. We'll talk about the finals that have gone final on Tuesday night. Actually, I'm hosting the live postcast. We'll talk about that. And then on Wednesday's postgame pod, we'll, of course, know what that final looks like, what those finals look like. So we'll talk about all that here coming up over the next couple of days. But intense tiebreaker scenarios in the West. The conference tiebreaker, by the way, will only come into play if there's a tie in the head-to-head tiebreaker. So I think that's pretty unlikely. Maybe if Denver gets thrown in there, that could, mess things up a little bit if somehow there's a 5-way tie. But as of now, it doesn't look like the Wolves conference record will matter all that much here down the stretch in the West. All right, let's close by talking Wolves Bucks. We'll peek ahead at the week. We'll talk about this matchup specifically. It's all upcoming here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is sponsored by Betterhelp. Taking care of your mental health is just as important as taking care of your physical health, but traditional in-person therapy can be expensive. It often ranges from $100 to $250 per session, and that's where Betterhelp comes in. With online therapy, you get quality care at a price that makes sense, saving you time and money. Therapy isn't just for life's toughest moments either. It can help with everyday stress, learning how to set boundaries, or maybe it's just developing positive coping skills. That's a really important thing. An important skill to have. Having access to support when you need it most can really make a big difference. And again, it's goes beyond what you might think of as a big situation or the toughest moment that you're going to experience. Every day can be hard. Like going through life every day, there's stress every day, there's anxiety every day, and BetterHelp is a good place to look if you're looking for some help. Your well-being is worth it. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. All right. Wolves Bucks tonight. And Minnesota has not seen Milwaukee since February 12th. So nearly 2 months ago. It was a 2-point loss for Minnesota. I believe Ant missed a shot at the buzzer. Or maybe might have been the Nas miss at the buzzer. This was like right after the trade deadline. Remember, Milwaukee had landed Kyle Kuzma, and the Bucks didn't have Giannis or Dame playing. It was a really one of a string of very disappointing losses for Minnesota. And they came into that game, favored by like 10 points. I think it was like 9.5 or 10 points. They ended up losing by a bucket. The Bucks got 19 and 13 from the recently acquired Kyle Kuzma. They got 21 points off the bench from Minnesota native Gary Trent Jr. Kevin Porter Jr. had 11, 8, and 5 off the bench for them. Minnesota had 28 and 7 from Ant, but it took him 33 shots to do it. He was 4 of 17 on 3-point attempts. Nas was only 1 of 7 on threes, but he had a 22 and 13. Rudy had 20 and 14. The Wolves were relatively healthy. Mike Conley did not play. He was still out. And Dante DiVincenzo was still out with his injury. And actually, so was Julius Randle. I forgot they were missing all those guys too. So Minnesota obviously shorthanded. No Conley, no Julius Randle, and no Dante DiVincenzo. Like Joe Ingles played rotation minutes off the bench. This was TJ Shannon. The bench in this game was TJ Shannon, Rob Dillingham, Jalen Clark, and Joe Ingles. However, on the flip side, no Giannis, no Dame for Milwaukee. Now, of course, currently there's no Dame for Milwaukee, so a very winnable situation once again for Minnesota. As of right now, the Timberwolves are, let's see, I don't believe the line's actually on FanDuel currently as of this recording, partly because of the questions surrounding the injury report. But there's some day-to-day guys for the Bucks, officially Giannis, Pat Connaughton, Bobby Portis, like a number of guys are still listed as questionable for them. And Milwaukee, for their part, isn't really playing for a lot. They're trying to hold off Detroit for the 5 seed in the West to be able to face the Pacers in the first round instead of the Knicks, which I guess is its motivation. They're a game and a half up on Detroit for the 5, but they're pretty well locked in otherwise. I mean, they're not going to, they can't finish in the play-in. So it's either they're going to finish 5. There's an outside chance they get up to 4 and catch the Pacers. They're 3 back. And, I don't know. What is it? I'm guessing there's probably an 80% chance they stay 5 in the East. Anyway, the game still matters to Milwaukee because they haven't locked up that 5 spot yet. This is obviously a game Minnesota should win, given no Dame for Milwaukee. It is on the road. It is at the Bucks, and the Wolves have a bit of momentum, whereas Milwaukee has kind of been floundering for a little while here. But overall, like looking at season-long stuff for the Bucks isn't super helpful because of the different phases that their team has been through. But as a team, something that stands out as potentially beneficial to Minnesota is Milwaukee is kind of middle of the pack defensively, and they do a pretty good job at locking down the paint and avoiding offensive rebounds for their opponents, and also defending without fouling. But they don't force a lot of turnovers. So they're really just kind of a solid defense. They play solid. They don't let you get second chance points. They do a pretty good job of defending the 3-point line. And obviously, Giannis being in there, being healthy makes a big difference. But they don't gamble. They don't force turnovers. They just play solid. That's beneficial to Minnesota because, as we know, the Wolves tend to go through these stretches where they just turn the ball over like crazy. And Milwaukee's not necessarily a team that's going to force anybody's hand when it comes to that. They don't play super fast. They're kind of middle of the pack in terms of pace as well. So that all bodes well for Minnesota. Offensively, because of Giannis mostly, the Bucks get to the line a ton. They also don't turn it over offensively, and they don't put any focus toward offensive rebounding themselves. They're actually dead last in offensive rebound rate. It all makes sense. I mean, you look at, again, they play solid defensively. Like that's kind of their MO is they just get back on defense. With no Dame, the free throw rate stuff is maybe a little bit less of a concern. Giannis is the only guy that averages more than 3 free throws per game, and he averages 10.5 per game. Of course, he's under 62%. Like he's worse than Rudy Gobert at the line. But Giannis is still Giannis. So that's obviously what you that's obviously what you got to look out for. And actually, that's part of the reason why Giannis is listed on, or why the line is off the board, is because both Giannis and Connaughton missed the last game out. They missed their last game. However, Giannis is supposed to play Tuesday night against the Wolves. That's what the reporting was on Monday. He is likely to play on Tuesday after not having played last time out on Saturday. The Pat Connaughton status is a little bit less clear. I believe he's still listed as questionable for this game. Let's see. Yes. They're saying I'm sorry. Yes, Giannis is back. Connaughton is still questionable. We know no Damian Lillard. We know no Jericho Sims, like some of these other guys that are out. But Connaughton's questionable. Giannis is probably going to be back. So a very winnable game for Minnesota. Probably the most difficult game left on the schedule unless Memphis really gets up to play Minnesota. And again, they've won a couple games in a row now, but that's Thursday. So if you're Minnesota and you play solid offensively, move the basketball, don't get bogged down like they did at times against Philadelphia, although I think it was more the defense against Philadelphia as a culprit than the offense. But don't get bogged down. Switch sides of the floor, move the basketball. That is going to be key for Minnesota in this game. The Bucks are going to make you work as an offense, make them pay if they don't rotate crisply enough, and make them pay for not forcing turnovers. Get good shots and make the open shots, and you'll be just fine. Defensively, they got to do their best to defend without fouling. It's something they've improved on over the course of the season. I think this game can end up being a win for Minnesota. I do think they'll win. I'm a little more worried about the Memphis game on Thursday at Memphis than I am about this one. I think the Wolves can beat the Bucks, assuming even if Giannis plays. I feel pretty good about this one for Minnesota. Just refresh. There we go. There's the line. The Wolves are favored by 4 points at Milwaukee on Tuesday night, which is actually a little bit higher than I would have expected. But again, Minnesota's healthy, knock on wood, and is playing much better, 5 wins in a row. So I'll be back on Wednesday with the post-game pod. However, tonight I'll actually be I'll be hosting a live postcast with Jack Borman over at Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube. So if you haven't listened before, typically hosted by Luke Inman along with Jack Borman. And I will be hosting this evening following Wolves Bucks. So go check it out after the game over at Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube. And then that audio will be posted to this audio feed. So the next episode in your feed will be the postcast from tonight that we're doing live. And then the one after that will be my post-game pod on Wednesday. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And a reminder that you can subscribe to the daily newsletter with all things Minnesota, all things NBA at LockedOnDaily.com. You get the email in your inbox every day, Monday through Friday. Again, sign up at LockedOnDaily.com. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.